The Apache got a bride no one wanted in a peace deal, but froze when she told him why. In the dust-covered settlement of Fort Benson, Arizona Territory, 1872, they were offering her like damaged goods at a market nobody wanted to attend. Margaret Holloway stood in the center of the fort's courtyard, her hands trembling inside her worn gloves, while the colonel read the terms of the peace treaty as if she were livestock being appraised. That's her, the cursed one. No decent man will have her. Better she goes to the savages. At least we'll be rid of the problem. But what Margaret didn't know was that the Apache warrior who stepped forward to claim her as part of the peace agreement was about to hear words that would shatter everything. He thought he understood about honor, about curses, and about the woman nobody wanted. And when she finally told him why, his blood would run cold with a truth darker than anyone could imagine. Because Margaret's secret wasn't just about her past, it was about his future. And it was about to set in motion a love story so powerful it would challenge everything both their worlds believed about fate, redemption, and the lies people tell to destroy what they fear. The Apache warrior's name was Takoda, which meant friend to everyone in his language, though the white settlers who feared him knew him only as the Silent Death. At 28, he had earned that name through countless battles, his face marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of the day soldiers had burned his village and killed his younger sister. He stood now in the blazing sun of Fort Benson, surrounded by 5 of his best warriors, listening to Colonel Preston drone on about peace terms and land agreements and promises that would be broken before the ink dried on the paper. But Takoda wasn't listening to the words. He was watching the woman. She stood apart from the other settlers, isolated like a diseased animal they feared might contaminate them. Her dress was clean but old, mended in several places with stitches so careful they spoke of pride despite poverty. Her posture was rigid, chin held high even as her hands shook. There was something in her eyes that Takoda recognized immediately, the look of someone who had survived something terrible and was still fighting to remain standing. As a gesture of goodwill, Colonel Preston continued, his voice thick with barely concealed disgust, the settlement offers a bride to cement this peace agreement. Margaret Holloway, step forward. The woman moved like someone walking to her execution. Each step was measured, controlled, as if she were using every ounce of willpower to keep from running. When she reached the center of the courtyard, she stopped and finally raised her eyes to meet Takoda's. The impact of that gaze hit him like a physical blow. Her eyes weren't just sad, they were haunted, filled with a depth of suffering that spoke of horrors beyond simple hardship. But there was also something else, something fierce and unbroken that refused to surrender despite everything. She's clean, healthy, can read and write, Preston said, as if listing the qualities of a horse. She'll make a suitable wife for one of your men. One of the settler women laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. Suitable? That's generous, Colonel. Tell them the truth about what she is. Margaret's face went white, but she didn't look away from Takoda. Her jaw tightened, and he saw her swallow hard, preparing herself for whatever humiliation was coming. She's barren, another woman called out. 6 years married and not a single child. Her husband died, calling her cursed. No man in 3 territories will have her. The words fell like stones into water, creating ripples of murmured agreement from the settlers. But Takoda noticed something strange. The way Margaret's shoulders had squared, the way her breathing had steadied. She wasn't collapsing under the weight of their cruelty. She was enduring it, as if she had learned long ago how to survive this particular kind of violence. Furthermore, Preston added, clearly uncomfortable, there have been incidents, unexplained occurrences around her. Some believe she brings misfortune. She's cursed by the devil himself, an old woman shrieked from the crowd. 3 men who courted her died within a month. Her husband's crops failed every year. The well on their property dried up the day she arrived. She's poison to everything she touches. Takoda's lieutenant, Neshoba, leaned close and whispered in Apache, "This is an insult, my chief. They offer us their trash and call it a gift. We should reject this and leave." But Takoda couldn't look away from Margaret. Something in her eyes called to him, a silent plea that wasn't for mercy but for understanding. She seemed to be gathering courage for something, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but feared the consequences. Finally she did speak, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough to reach him across the dusty courtyard. "Before you decide, I need to tell you something. Something about why they really want me gone." Dakota raised his hand, silencing Neshoba's protest. "Speak." Margaret glanced at Colonel Preston, whose face had gone pale. "Don't you dare," the colonel hissed. The agreement is based on lies," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. She looked directly at Dakota, and what he saw in her eyes made his blood run cold. It wasn't fear, it was warning. "They're not giving me to you as a bride," she said clearly. "They're giving me to you as a weapon. And if you take me back to your people, everyone you love will die." The courtyard erupted in chaos. Preston lunged forward, trying to clap a hand over Margaret's mouth, but she dodged him with surprising agility. Settlers shouted denials and accusations. Dakota's warriors reached for their weapons, sensing betrayal. But Dakota stood frozen, his mind racing. A weapon, what did she mean? And why would she warn him if she was part of their plot? Margaret's eyes never left his as she shouted over the pandemonium. "I have smallpox scars hidden under my clothes. They healed, but I'm still contagious. They know your people have no immunity. They're sending me to destroy your tribe from within, and they're calling it a peace offering." The world seemed to stop spinning. Dakota understood immediately the magnitude of what she had just revealed. Smallpox had devastated Apache communities before, wiping out entire villages. If she was still contagious, bringing her to his people would be genocide disguised as diplomacy. Preston's face had turned purple with rage. "Seize her! She's ruined everything." But Dakota's mind was working faster than it had ever worked before. This woman had just sacrificed herself to save his people. She had chosen truth over survival, knowing that her revelation would likely mean her death at the hands of her own people. Who did that? Who chose honor when self-preservation was the easier path? As soldiers rushed toward Margaret and his warriors tensed for battle, Dakota made a decision that would change everything. "Stop," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. He stepped forward, moving between Margaret and the advancing soldiers. "This woman has shown more honor than anyone in this fort. She warned me of your treachery at the cost of her own life. That is the act of a warrior, not a curse." He turned to Margaret, whose eyes were wide with shock. "You tried to save my people. Now I will save you." The chaos that erupted in Fort Benson's courtyard was unlike anything the settlement had seen in its 10 years of existence. Colonel Preston screamed orders that nobody followed. Settlers scattered like frightened chickens, and Dakota's warriors formed a protective circle around their chief and the woman he had just claimed as his responsibility. "You can't take her," Preston roared, his hand moving to his sidearm. "She's diseased. She'll kill you all." "Then why were you so eager to give her to us?" Dakota countered, his voice dangerously calm. "If she is cursed as you claim, why did you offer her as a bride? Unless, of course, you intended exactly what she revealed, to use her as a weapon against my people." The colonel's face betrayed him, flushing deep red before going pale. Around them, the more intelligent settlers had the decency to look ashamed, understanding now that their leaders had been willing to commit mass murder and call it diplomacy. Margaret stood perfectly still within the circle of Apache warriors, hardly daring to breathe. She had expected to die the moment the words left her mouth. She had spent 6 years being blamed for every misfortune, called cursed and evil, driven to the edges of society. When the colonel had told her about the Peace Bride plan, she had known immediately what it really was: a death sentence for an entire people, delivered by her unwitting hands. She couldn't let that happen. Whatever else people said about her, whatever curse they believed she carried, she wouldn't be used as an instrument of genocide, even if the truth meant her own death. But now this Apache warrior, this man whose people she had been meant to destroy, stood between her and the soldiers' rifles. It made no sense. Unless... "She's lying to save herself," a settler woman shrieked. "There's no disease. She's just trying to worm her way into their camp to spy for us." Dakota turned his sharp gaze to the woman. "Then you won't mind if she stays here? If there is no disease, there is no danger to anyone." The silence that followed was damning. Nobody stepped forward to reclaim Margaret. Nobody offered her shelter or protection. The truth was written in their terrified faces. They believed she was contagious, and they had been willing to use that as a weapon. The peace treaty, Preston began, but Dakota cut him off with a gesture. There is no peace between people who attempt genocide through deception, he said coldly. The treaty is void, but I am taking this woman with me, not as a bride, but as proof of your treachery. When the territorial governor hears how you attempted to use disease as a weapon of war, your career will be over, Colonel. It was a brilliant move, Margaret realized. By reframing her as evidence rather than a bride, Dakota had found a way to remove her from danger while also protecting his own people from potential contagion. She would be kept isolated, studied from a distance, while her testimony could be used to expose the Colonel's murderous plot. She's worthless as a witness, Preston snarled desperately. She's a known liar. Her own husband denounced her before he died. Nobody will believe the word of a cursed woman. They will believe the word of an Apache chief who refused a poisoned gift, Dakota replied. He turned to his warriors. Nashoba, ride ahead and tell our medicine woman to prepare a quarantine area. This woman will be kept separate until we know the truth of her condition. As Nashoba galloped away, Dakota finally addressed Margaret directly. Can you ride? Yes, Margaret managed, her voice hoarse with unshed tears. Nobody had asked her what she could do in years. Everyone had simply told her what she couldn't do, what she wasn't allowed to be. Then you will ride with Kitani. He will ensure you don't fall. Dakota gestured to one of his warriors, a younger man whose face showed more curiosity than hostility. We leave now before the Colonel decides that dead witnesses tell no tales. Margaret found herself being lifted onto a horse behind Kitani before she could fully process what was happening. The warrior's hands were respectful, careful not to touch her more than necessary, whether out of respect for her as a person or fear of contagion she couldn't tell. As they prepared to ride out, Margaret felt compelled to speak once more. Why? She called to Dakota. Why save someone everyone else believes is cursed? Dakota had already mounted his horse, but he paused and looked back at her. For the first time, she saw something soften in his scarred face. Not pity, but something deeper. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. My sister's name was Ayana, he said quietly. She had a birthmark that covered half her face. The missionaries who came to our village called it the devil's mark. They said she was cursed, that she would bring misfortune to anyone who touched her. Margaret's breath caught. She knew this story. She knew how it ended. When the soldiers came and burned our village, Dakota continued, his voice tight with controlled emotion, Ayana ran to the missionaries for help. She believed they would protect her, because she had been learning their prayers. Instead, they locked the door and let her burn, saying it was God's will to purge the devil from our midst. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. I'm sorry, she whispered. People fear what they don't understand, Dakota said. They call it cursed to justify their cruelty. My sister wasn't cursed. She was innocent. And I believe you are too. With that, he turned his horse and led them out of Fort Benson at a gallop. Margaret clung to Kitani's waist, her mind reeling from everything that had happened in the last hour. She had gone from being offered as a sacrificial weapon to being rescued by the very people she was meant to destroy. They rode hard for 3 hours, putting distance between themselves and any soldiers who might follow. The desert landscape was harsh and beautiful, so different from the green hills of Ohio where Margaret had grown up. Red rocks jutted from the earth like ancient sentinels, and the sky stretched endlessly overhead, so blue it almost hurt to look at. When they finally stopped to rest the horses, Margaret was exhausted, her body aching from the unfamiliar ride. Kitani helped her down carefully, still maintaining that cautious distance. Water, he said simply, offering her a canteen. Margaret drank gratefully, the warm liquid soothing her parched throat. As she handed back the canteen, she noticed Kitani studying her with open curiosity. You speak truth about sickness? He asked in halting English. Margaret nodded slowly. I was sick 2 years ago. Very sick. My husband's mother brought me to a doctor in Tucson who confirmed it was smallpox. I survived, but... She gestured helplessly. My husband died 3 months later, not from the disease, but from drinking himself to death because he believed I had cursed him. Husband was fool, Kitani said with surprising vehemence. You survive great sickness. That is strength, not curse. It was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years. Margaret felt fresh tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough. She needed to be strong now, to face whatever came next. Takoda approached, his movements careful, maintaining distance. Our medicine woman, Kimimela, will examine you when we arrive. She has treated the spotted sickness before and survived it herself. She will know if you are still dangerous. And if I am, Margaret asked, needing to know. Then you will live apart until you are healed, Takoda said simply. We do not abandon those who need help, but we also do not allow harm to come to our people through carelessness. It was fair, more than fair. Margaret nodded her acceptance. As they prepared to ride again, she noticed how Takoda's warriors treated him. With respect, yes, but also with genuine affection. They joked quietly among themselves, their laughter soft but real. It was so different from the grim silence and suspicion that had surrounded her in Fort Benson. Takoda, she called as he mounted his horse. He looked back at her. Thank you, for believing me, for saving me. His scarred face was impossible to read in the fading light. You saved yourself, he said, by choosing truth. I merely recognized the value of that choice. As they rode toward the Apache camp and an uncertain future, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years beginning to grow in her chest. Not hope, exactly. She had learned not to trust hope too easily, but possibility. The fragile, terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could have a life that wasn't defined by other people's fears and cruelties. What she didn't know yet was that Takoda had his own secrets, his own reasons for understanding what it meant to be called cursed, and that those secrets would soon collide with hers in ways neither of them could anticipate. Because the truth about Margaret's curse was far more complex than anyone realized. And when it finally came to light, it would threaten not just their growing connection, but the survival of both their peoples. The chaos in Fort Benson's courtyard exploded like a powder keg. Colonel Preston screamed orders that nobody followed, settlers scattered in panic, and Takoda's warriors formed a protective circle around their chief and the woman who had just exposed a plot of genocide. You can't take her, Preston roared, his hand moving to his sidearm. She's diseased. Then why were you so eager to give her to us? Takoda countered, his voice dangerously calm. Unless you intended exactly what she revealed, to use her as a weapon against my people. The colonel's face betrayed him, flushing red before going pale. Around them, some settlers looked ashamed, understanding now that their leaders had attempted mass murder disguised as diplomacy. Margaret stood frozen within the circle of Apache warriors, hardly daring to breathe. She had expected to die the moment the truth left her mouth. 6 years of being blamed for every misfortune, called cursed and evil, driven to society's edges. When Colonel Preston explained the Peace Bride plan, she had known immediately what it truly was. A death sentence for an entire people, delivered by her unwitting hands. She couldn't let that happen. Whatever curse people believed she carried, she wouldn't become an instrument of genocide, even if truth meant her own death. But now this Apache warrior stood between her and the soldiers' rifles. It made no sense. She's lying, a settler woman shrieked. There's no disease, she's trying to spy for us. Takoda turned his sharp gaze to her. Then you won't mind if she stays here? The damning silence that followed spoke volumes. Nobody stepped forward to reclaim Margaret. The truth was written in their terrified faces. They believed she was contagious and had weaponized that. There is no peace between people who attempt genocide through deception, Takoda said coldly. I'm taking this woman as proof of your treachery. When the territorial governor hears how you used disease as a weapon, your career is over, Colonel. Brilliant, Margaret realized. By reframing her as evidence rather than a bride, Takoda could remove her from danger while protecting his people from potential contagion. Can you ride? Takoda asked her directly. Yes, Margaret managed, her voice hoarse. Nobody had asked what she could do in years. Then you ride with Kitani. Takoda gestured to a younger warrior. We leave before the colonel decides dead witnesses tell no tales. As Margaret was lifted onto a horse, she called out, Why? Why save someone everyone believes is cursed? Takoda paused, something softening in his scarred face. My sister had a birthmark covering half her face. Missionaries called it the devil's mark, said she was cursed. When soldiers burned our village, she ran to the missionaries for help. They locked the door and let her burn, calling it God's will. Margaret's tears came freely. People fear what they don't understand, Dakota said. They call it cursed to justify their cruelty. My sister wasn't cursed. She was innocent, and I believe you are too. They rode hard into the desert, leaving Fort Benson behind. Margaret clung to Kitani, her mind reeling. She had gone from sacrificial weapon to rescued survivor in 1 hour. When they stopped to rest, Kitani offered water. You speak truth about sickness? Margaret nodded. I survived smallpox 2 years ago. My husband died 3 months later. Not from disease, but from drinking himself to death because he believed I cursed him. Husband was fool, Kitani said firmly. You survived great sickness. That is strength, not curse. The kindest word she'd heard in years. Dakota approached, maintaining careful distance. Our medicine woman will examine you. She survived the spotted sickness herself. She'll know if you're still dangerous. And if I am? Then you live apart until healed, Dakota said simply. We don't abandon those who need help, but we protect our people. As they rode toward the Apache camp, Margaret felt something fragile growing in her chest. Not hope, she'd learned not to trust hope, but possibility. The terrifying possibility of a life not defined by others' fears. What she didn't know was that Dakota had his own secrets, and when they collided with hers, everything would change. The Apache camp appeared in the distance like a mirage, shimmering against the red desert rocks. Margaret had expected something primitive, perhaps crude shelters that matched the savage reputation white settlers insisted on. Instead, she saw an organized community of wickiups arranged in careful patterns, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing near a stream, and women working hides with expert precision. As they rode in, the camp fell silent. Eyes tracked Margaret with suspicion and curiosity. Mothers pulled children closer. Warriors reached for weapons, not threatening but alert. An elderly woman emerged from the largest wickiup, her silver hair adorned with turquoise beads, her face marked by the distinctive scars of smallpox survival. This had to be Kimimela, the medicine woman. She spoke rapidly in Apache to Dakota, her gestures sharp and questioning. Dakota responded calmly, and Margaret caught her own name several times in the conversation. Finally, Kimimela turned to Margaret. You claim spotted sickness. Her English was heavily accented but clear. I had it 2 years ago, Margaret confirmed. I survived, but my husband didn't. Neither did 3 others in our settlement. They blamed me. Kimimela stepped closer, studying Margaret's face with intense scrutiny. Show arms. Margaret hesitated, then rolled up her sleeves. The faded scars were still visible, the telltale marks of smallpox survival dotting her skin like a constellation of shame. The medicine woman's expression changed from suspicion to something gentler. You live through great death, but you no longer carry death to others. Scars are old, healed. You are safe. Relief crashed over Margaret so powerfully, her knees nearly buckled. You're certain? I see this sickness many times, Kimimela said firmly. I know when danger passes. You were dangerous once, maybe 1 year passed. Now no. The white people keep you afraid with lies. Dakota had been standing nearby, and Margaret saw his shoulders relax slightly at Kimimela's pronouncement. Then she can stay in camp. She can stay, Kimimela confirmed. Then her sharp eyes narrowed. But there is something else, something you not tell us, white woman. Margaret's breath caught. How could this woman possibly know? The spotted sickness. It takes some women's moon blood, makes them unable to carry children, Kimimela continued. This happened to you, yes? This is why they call you cursed. Tears burned Margaret's eyes. Yes, my husband wanted children desperately. When I couldn't give him any, when his crops failed and his business crumbled, he blamed me for everything. He drank himself to death, cursing my name. Fool man, Kimimela spat. Sickness takes what it takes. Not your fault, not curse. Just life's cruelty. But then the medicine woman's expression shifted, becoming unreadable. There is more. Something you fear to speak. Something about the night your husband died. Margaret went rigid. Nobody knew about that night. Nobody could know. I see truth in faces, Kimimela pressed. You carry guilt heavy as stones. What happened? The camp had gathered around them now, sensing important revelations. Takoda watched Margaret intently, his scarred face revealing nothing but his eyes, showing something that might have been concern. Margaret's voice dropped to barely a whisper. My husband didn't just drink himself to death. The night he died, he came home drunk and violent. He said if I couldn't give him children, I was worthless. He said he would kill me and find a real woman. She paused, her hands trembling. He attacked me with a knife. We fought. The knife ended up in his chest. I don't even know if I pushed it or if he fell on it. But everyone assumed his death was my curse, not self-defense. They called me cursed because it was easier than admitting what he tried to do to me. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Takoda spoke, his voice carrying the weight of authority. A woman who defends her life from a man trying to kill her is not cursed. She is a warrior. In our culture, such a woman is honored, not condemned. But even as relief flooded through Margaret at his words, Kimimela's eyes widened with something that looked like recognition and fear. Wait, the medicine woman said sharply. Your husband's name, what was it? Thomas Holloway, Margaret answered, confused by the sudden intensity. Kimimela turned to Takoda, speaking rapidly in Apache. Whatever she said made every warrior present tense immediately, hands moving to weapons. Takoda's face had gone stone cold. Holloway, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Thomas Holloway was the lieutenant who led the raid on my village, who gave the order to burn the mission with my sister inside. The world tilted sideways. Margaret stared at Takoda in horror. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear I didn't know what he'd done. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Margaret saw the hatred blazing in the eyes of Takoda's warriors, the way their hands tightened on their weapons. She had been married to the monster who had murdered Takoda's sister, who had burned innocent people alive. I didn't know, she repeated, her voice breaking. He never told me about the raids. He never spoke of what he did in the war. When he came home, he was already broken, already drinking. I thought it was just the war itself that haunted him. How convenient, Neshoba spat, stepping forward with his knife drawn. The wife of our greatest enemy delivered to us like a gift. This was the plan all along, to make us trust her, then strike when we're vulnerable. No. Margaret backed away, but there was nowhere to go. I chose to warn you about the disease. I could have stayed silent and let you all die. Why would I do that if I wanted to harm you? Perhaps to gain our trust for a larger betrayal later, another warrior suggested darkly. But Takoda raised his hand, silencing them. His face was unreadable, but Margaret could see the war raging behind his eyes, the desire for vengeance against anything connected to his sister's murderer, battling against what he had witnessed of Margaret's character. She saved my people, Takoda said finally, his voice rough with controlled emotion. She sacrificed her own safety to warn us of treachery. Those are not the actions of an enemy. She was married to Thomas Holloway, Neshoba insisted. She shared his bed, his home, his life. How can we trust anything about her? I hated him, Margaret said suddenly, her voice stronger now. I hated what he had become, what he did to me. When he died, I felt relief, not grief. And when I learned later that he had committed atrocities during his service, I was glad he was dead. Does that make me evil? Or does it make me human? Kimimela had been silent throughout the confrontation, but now she spoke. The spirits show me truth in dreams. Last night, I dreamed of a woman with red hair standing between two worlds, preventing a great fire. I did not understand until now. She looked at Takoda. This woman is not her husband. She carries his name but not his sins. Takoda's jaw tightened. Neshoba, take the warriors and scout the perimeter. Make sure we weren't followed. It was clearly a dismissal, a way to give himself time to think without his men's anger pressing on him. Once they were gone, only Kimimela, Takoda, and Margaret remained. May I speak? Margaret asked quietly. Takoda nodded stiffly. Your sister's name was Ayana, you said. Tell me about her. Not about how she died, but about who she was when she lived. It was a bold request, perhaps even offensive given the circumstances, but Margaret needed him to see her as someone capable of honoring the dead, not just as the wife of their killer. Dakota was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly he began to speak. She loved to sing. Every morning she would wake before dawn and sing to greet the sun. Her voice was like water over stones, clear, bright, full of joy. His scarred face softened with memory. The birthmark they called evil covered her left cheek and eye. But when she smiled, you forgot it was there. You only saw her light. "She sounds beautiful," Margaret whispered. "She was 14 years old," Dakota continued, his voice tight. "She had never harmed anyone. She believed the missionaries when they said God loved all his children. She ran to them for protection because she trusted their words." He looked directly at Margaret. "Your husband locked that door. He listened to her screaming and did nothing." Margaret's tears fell freely now. "I cannot undo what he did. I cannot bring her back or erase her suffering. All I can do is tell you that if I had known, if I had been there, I would have fought him. I would have opened that door or died trying." "Words are easy," Dakota said, but there was less anger in his voice now, more pain. "Then let me prove it with actions," Margaret said desperately. "Let me stay. Let me serve your people. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to balance the scales, even though I know they can never truly be balanced. Let me honor Ayana's memory by being the kind of person she would have wanted in this world." Kimimela made a sound that might have been approval. "The white woman speaks with honor. Perhaps the spirit sent her to heal what was broken." Dakota stood abruptly and walked away, his back rigid with tension. Margaret thought he was leaving, rejecting her plea, but instead he stopped at the edge of the camp, staring out at the desert that stretched endlessly under the setting sun. When he finally spoke, his voice carried on the evening wind. "You may stay, but you will be watched. Any sign of betrayal, any hint of deception, and my mercy ends." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was a chance. "Thank you," Margaret breathed. As Dakota walked away into the gathering darkness, Kimimela touched Margaret's arm gently. "He is a good man, but wounded deep. Wounded men lash out or they heal. We must help him choose healing." "How?" Margaret asked helplessly. "By being patient, by being present, by showing him that not all white people are his enemy." The medicine woman smiled slightly. "And by learning our ways. Come, I teach you to prepare food as we do. Start with small things. Build trust like building fire, one stick at a time." Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into learning everything she could about Apache life. She worked alongside the women, her hands becoming rough and capable as she learned to tan hides, grind corn, weave baskets. The children, innocent of adult prejudices, began to warm to her first, fascinated by her strange red hair and different ways of speaking. Dakota kept his distance, watching her with those unreadable eyes, but Margaret noticed things: how he always ensured she had enough food, how he positioned guards near her wickiup not to imprison her, but to protect her from warriors who still harbored resentment, how his gaze would linger on her when he thought she wasn't looking, something like wonder mixing with his lingering pain. One evening, Margaret was helping prepare the communal meal when a child, a little girl of perhaps 6, came running into camp crying. She had stepped on a cactus, and dozens of tiny spines pierced her foot. The girl's mother tried to remove them, but the child screamed and thrashed, making it impossible. Margaret approached slowly. "May I try?" she asked gently. The mother hesitated, then nodded. Margaret knelt beside the girl and began to sing, an old lullaby her own mother had sung to her long ago. The child's screaming faded to whimpers as Margaret's voice wove a spell of comfort. While she sang, her fingers worked carefully, removing each spine with practiced precision, learned from her grandmother, who had been a healer. When the last spine was removed and the foot cleaned, the little girl threw her arms around Margaret's neck. "Thank you, White Mother," she whispered. Margaret looked up to find Dakota standing nearby, having witnessed the entire scene. For the first time since learning of her connection to Thomas Holloway, something other than wariness showed in his eyes. That night, he came to speak with her, as she sat outside her wickiup looking at the stars. "You are good with children," he said, sitting at a respectful distance. "I always wanted my own," Margaret admitted, "but the sickness took that possibility away." "Among my people there are many ways to be a mother," Takoda said quietly. "Blood is not the only bond that matters. The woman who teaches, who comforts, who guides, she too is a mother." It was the kindest thing he had said to her since the revelation about her husband. Margaret felt her heart crack open slightly, letting in a fragile beam of hope. "Takoda," she said softly, "I need you to know something. When I warned you about the disease, when I chose to tell the truth, I wasn't just saving your people. I was saving myself, because living as a weapon even unknowingly would have destroyed whatever good was left in my soul." He turned to look at her fully, and in the firelight, his scarred face was beautiful in its strength. "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about that. About the courage it took to speak truth when silence would have been safer. About how you chose honor over survival." "I chose to be the opposite of what Thomas Holloway was," Margaret said firmly. "Every day I choose to be his opposite." Something shifted in Takoda's expression, not forgiveness yet, but understanding, recognition of a kindred spirit who also carried the weight of past horrors and chose daily to be better than them. "My sister would have liked you," he said finally. "She always believed people could change, could choose goodness even when the world showed them cruelty." Tears slipped down Margaret's cheeks. "I will try to live in a way that honors her memory." Takoda reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his scarred hand gently wiped a tear from her face. The touch was brief, respectful, but it sent lightning through Margaret's entire being. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "the Spirit sent you to teach me that revenge and justice are not the same thing, that punishing you for your husband's crimes would make me no better than those who killed my sister." In that moment, under the vast desert stars, something profound passed between them. Not love yet, it was too soon, too complicated, but the possibility of love. The recognition that two broken people might perhaps help each other heal. What neither of them knew was that danger was already riding toward them, carrying secrets that would test everything they were building together. The rider appeared at dawn, his horse lathered with foam from being driven too hard. Nashoba spotted him first and raised the alarm, warriors scrambling to defensive positions. But as the figure came closer, Margaret recognized the uniform of a U.S. Marshal. Her blood ran cold. The Marshal was accompanied by two soldiers, and horrifyingly by a face Margaret had prayed never to see again. Reverend Silas Crane, the missionary who had locked the door on Ayana and the others, condemning them to burn alive. "I'm Marshal William Garrett," the man announced, his voice carrying across the camp. "I'm here on official business regarding Margaret Holloway, wanted for the murder of Lieutenant Thomas Holloway." Margaret's world shattered. She had known people suspected her, but she never imagined they would pursue formal charges. Takoda stepped forward, his body language radiating controlled menace. "This woman is under the protection of the Apache. You have no authority here." "The hell I don't," Garrett shot back. "She murdered a decorated military officer. The territorial governor wants her tried and hanged. You harboring her makes you complicit." But it was Reverend Crane who spoke next, his voice dripping with false piety. "I knew Thomas Holloway well. A good Christian man destroyed by that cursed woman. She bewitched him, drove him to drink, then killed him in cold blood." "He tried to kill me first," Margaret shouted, stepping forward despite Takoda's warning hand. "He came home drunk and violent. He said if I couldn't give him children I was worthless. He attacked me with a knife." "Lies," Crane said smoothly. "The desperate words of a murderess trying to escape justice. I counseled Thomas many times about his troubled marriage. He confided in me that she threatened him repeatedly, that he feared for his life." Margaret stared at the Reverend in disbelief. "You're the one who should be on trial. You locked Ayana in that mission. You let her burn alive." Crane's face went pale, then red with rage. "I saved Christian souls that day by preventing the spread of savagery. That girl was marked by the devil. Her death was God's will." Takoda moved so fast that nobody could stop him. His knife was at Crane's throat before the Marshal could draw his weapon. "Say her name," Dakota growled, his voice deadly quiet. "Say my sister's name, you coward." "Dakota, no." Margaret grabbed his arm. "He wants you to kill him. It would give them reason to destroy your entire tribe. Don't let him win." For a terrible moment, Dakota's hand trembled with the desire for vengeance. Margaret could see the war in his eyes, justice crying out for blood, wisdom counseling restraint. Finally, with visible effort, Dakota lowered the knife, but his eyes promised death. "If you ever speak of my sister again, no marshal will save you." Garrett had his gun drawn now. "That's threatening a man of God. I could arrest you right now." "Try it," Neshoba said from behind him, his own weapon pressed against the marshal's back. They had been so focused on Dakota that nobody noticed the other warriors moving into position. It was a standoff that could turn bloody in seconds. "There's something you should know, Marshal," Margaret said desperately. "Thomas Holloway wasn't the hero you think he was. He led the raid that burned the San Xavier mission with innocent people inside. He committed war crimes." "Lies," Crane interjected quickly. Too quickly. "Is it?" Margaret pressed. "Why are you so eager to defend him, Reverend? Unless you were there too. Unless you're afraid that if I talk, the truth about that day will finally come out." Garrett's eyes narrowed, looking between Margaret and Crane. "What truth?" "The truth that Thomas Holloway wasn't following orders that day," Margaret continued, her mind racing. "I found his journal after he died. He wrote about how Reverend Crane identified which buildings housed Apache families, which ones had children, how together they planned to cleanse the territory of the savage threat. It was a gamble. Margaret had found no such journal, but she had lived with Thomas long enough to know his habits, his darkness, and she saw Crane's face go ashen, confirming her guess. "That's a lie," Crane whispered, but his voice wavered. "Then you won't mind if we search your mission records," Garrett said slowly. "See if there's any correspondence between you and Holloway from that time." Crane's silence was damning, but then the Reverend smiled, a cold, cruel expression. "It doesn't matter what you find. I have 20 witnesses who will testify that Margaret Holloway murdered her husband in cold blood. She'll hang regardless, and when she does, her lies die with her." Dakota's hand found Margaret's, squeezing gently. A silent promise of protection. But they both knew the truth. If the marshal took her, she would never survive to trial. Accidents happen to prisoners all the time. "I'll make you a deal," Margaret said suddenly. "I'll go with you voluntarily, no resistance. But in exchange, you investigate Reverend Crane's connection to the San Xavier massacre. Get a real judge involved, not just territorial politics." "Margaret, no," Dakota said urgently in Apache. "They will kill you." "If I don't go, they'll use it as an excuse to attack your people," Margaret replied in the same language she had been learning. "I won't let more innocents die because of me." Garrett considered. "You have my word as a U.S. Marshal. We'll investigate the Reverend's involvement, but you come peacefully." Before anyone could stop her, Margaret stepped forward, holding out her wrists for shackles. As the cold metal closed around them, she looked back at Dakota one last time. His face showed anguish, rage, and something else. Something that looked like love finally acknowledged too late. "I'll come for you," he said in English so everyone could hear. "Nothing will stop me." As they led Margaret away, Kimimela approached Dakota. "The white woman sacrifices herself for us. Again. This is not coincidence. This is fate." "Then fate is cruel," Dakota said, watching Margaret disappear into the distance. But Neshoba was already gathering warriors. "We don't let fate decide. We decide. When do we ride to save her?" Dakota's scarred face hardened with determination. "Tonight. We prepare tonight. Tomorrow we bring her home." What none of them knew was that Reverend Crane had already sent word ahead to Fort Benson, and that Colonel Preston, furious about his failed plague plot being exposed, had ordered Margaret's accidental death during transport. The real battle was just beginning. Margaret sat in the prison wagon, hands shackled, as the desert sun beat down mercilessly. Marshal Garrett rode ahead with his soldiers, while Reverend Crane kept his horse close to the wagon, watching her with eyes that promised suffering. "You should have kept your mouth shut," Crane hissed when Garrett was out of earshot. "Did you really think your accusations would matter? I am a man of God. You are a cursed woman, a murderess. Who do you think they'll believe?" "The truth has a way of coming out," Margaret said quietly, though fear gnawed at her insides. "The truth is whatever I say it is," Crane smiled. "By the time we reach Fort Benson, you'll have tragically died trying to escape. The savages you love so much will be blamed, of course. It will give the army the excuse they need to wipe them out completely." Ice flooded Margaret's veins. This had been the plan all along. Not justice, but genocide. She was simply the excuse they needed. "Colonel Preston sends his regards," Crane added with malicious pleasure. "He's quite angry about his peace treaty failure. Seems you cost him his reputation. He's eager to return the favor." Margaret said nothing, but her mind raced. She had to escape, had to warn Dakota. But shackled in a moving wagon with armed guards, her options were non-existent. The day wore on, the sun climbing higher. They stopped briefly at noon to rest the horses. Garrett approached the wagon with water, his expression troubled. "Mrs. Holloway," he said quietly, "I'm starting to think there's more to your story than I was told." "Marshal, you have to listen," Margaret said urgently. "Reverend Crane just threatened to kill me and blame it on the Apache. He wants to provoke a war." Garrett's jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation." "Search his belongings," Margaret pressed. "He must have correspondence with Colonel Preston, evidence of their conspiracy." "I don't need a cursed woman telling me how to do my job," Garrett said, but his eyes were thoughtful. He walked away, leaving Margaret with a sliver of hope. That night they made camp in a narrow canyon. Margaret was locked in the wagon while the men sat around the fire. She could hear their voices, but not their words. Hours passed. The camp grew quiet as most men fell asleep. Only one guard remained awake, and he looked barely alert. Then Margaret heard it, the softest whisper of movement in the darkness. Her heart leaped. She knew those sounds. Apache warriors, moving like ghosts. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Free. After years of being called cursed, hunted, blamed, she was finally, legally free. "There's more," Garrett continued. "Crane broke under interrogation, confessed everything, including the San Xavier massacre. He and Holloway planned it together, targeting families to cleanse the territory. It wasn't a military operation, it was murder." Dakota's face showed no satisfaction, only deep sadness. "This does not bring back my sister." "No," Garrett agreed, "but it gives her justice, and it means the official record will show the truth. Your sister Ayana and the others who died, they'll be remembered as victims of a crime, not casualties of war." It was something, not enough, but something. "Why are you doing this?" Margaret asked. "You could have buried the evidence." Garrett looked at her directly. "Because I became a marshal to uphold justice, not to serve corrupt men. And because you risked everything to tell the truth when lying would have been safer. That kind of courage deserves to be answered with the same." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. The territorial governor wants to establish a formal peace treaty with the Apache. A real one this time, with fair terms. He's asking if Chief Dakota would be willing to negotiate." Dakota looked at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "I will consider it," he said finally. "But any treaty must include protection for my people, our lands, and our way of life." "I'll convey your terms," Garrett promised and rode away. As the marshal disappeared into the desert, Margaret felt Dakota's hand slip into hers. Over the past weeks, their relationship had deepened in ways neither had anticipated. What had begun as rescue and gratitude had blossomed into genuine love, complicated, hard-won, but real. "Marry me," Dakota said suddenly. "In both traditions, Apache and white. Let our union be proof that two worlds can become one when built on truth and respect." "Yes," Margaret breathed. 1,000 times, yes. The wedding took place under the full moon, with Kimimela presiding over Apache rites, while Marshal Garrett, who had returned as witness and friend, read from a Bible he carried. It was unorthodox, unprecedented, and perfect. Margaret wore a dress of soft deerskin decorated with beadwork, her red hair adorned with turquoise. Dakota wore his ceremonial clothing, his scarred face proud and open in a way it had never been before. As they spoke their vows, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them here. She had been offered as a weapon of genocide, rejected as cursed, hunted as a criminal. He had been a warrior consumed by grief and rage, unable to see past his pain. But together they had found something neither had been looking for: redemption through love, healing through truth, and the courage to build something new from the ashes of their broken pasts. 5 years later, Margaret stood outside their home, a structure that combined Apache and settler building techniques, symbolizing their blended life. She was teaching a mixed group of Apache and settler children to read, part of the peace agreement Dakota had negotiated. Their adopted daughter, a girl orphaned by violence on both sides, played nearby. They had named her Ayana, honoring Dakota's sister by giving another child the chance to live the life she had been denied. Dakota approached, sliding his arms around Margaret's waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked. "Completely," Margaret replied, leaning back against him. Though if someone had told me years ago that the cursed woman nobody wanted would end up married to an Apache chief, mother to beautiful children, and teacher to both our peoples, I would never have believed it. "People feared what they didn't understand about you," Dakota said. "They called you cursed because acknowledging your strength, your resilience, your goodness would have required them to face their own cruelty." Margaret turned in his arms to face him. "You saw past the curse. You saw me. You saved my people. You saved my soul," Dakota replied, touching his forehead to hers. "You taught me that healing is possible, that love can bridge any divide, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come in the most unexpected forms." As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret reflected on the truth she had learned through her journey, that curses are often just other people's fears given voice, that being unwanted by the wrong people is sometimes life's greatest blessing, and that real love doesn't erase the past, it redeems it by building a better future. She had been the bride nobody wanted, but in being rejected by a world that feared her, she had found her way to the one person who saw her true value. And together, they had proven that sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply refusing to believe the lies others tell about who you're meant to be. Tell me, have you ever been labeled as too much or not enough by people who couldn't see your true worth? Have you ever felt like the person nobody wanted, only to discover that being rejected by the wrong people led you exactly where you needed to be? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share it with someone who needs to remember that their value is never determined by those who are too blind to see it. Sometimes being the bride nobody wanted is the beginning of becoming the woman everyone respects.